Hello and welcome to the 3D Blu-ray Bunker. This is a place for us die-hard fans of 3D where I look exclusively at 3D Blu-rays, not to do a movie review but to focus almost entirely on the film's 3D, with just a short word at the end about the film itself. And this time I'm looking at the 2012 film Men in Black 3. It's got an aspect ratio of 1.85 to 1 and it was post-converted into 3D. Like Triple X The Return of Xander Cage, this film is a part 3 in 3D, where the title of the film doesn't make anything of that fact, unlike the 1980s with the likes of Jaws 3D, where it was more baked into the title. I guess filmmakers must be a bit more sophisticated these days, so want to avoid doing anything so obvious, although I'm not too sure that either Triple X or Men in Black suffer from a surfeit of sophistication. Anyway, straight on to the aliens, and I think this character is fairly typical of the film's 3D. I mean, there is some sense of 3D to this shot, albeit not a massive amount, and then he moves closer to the camera and pops out of the screen, although again, only in a fairly mild way, and I think relevantly, not in a way where the composition is very sympathetic to good 3D, as he's breaking the top and bottom of the frame. When Will Smith fights him off by squirting some mustard up his nose, and there's the tone of the film right there, we get Smith's point of view shot, and the jet of mustard is firing from quite a way out of the screen, but I'd have thought it would have been a bit more obvious to get that from the alien's point of view, with the squirt coming towards him and us, which could have been a bit more fun. Also, whilst I quite like the design of the film's aliens, someone like this guy has quite a flat face, which is maybe not a great design from a 3D point of view. I remember back in 2012, people were quite enthusiastic about this film's 3D, and it does have a few good moments in it, but on the whole, I think that what was impressive for a post-conversion in 2012 maybe doesn't quite cut the mustard today. And a lot of this film's 3D doesn't look all that special. Quite a lot of the character close-ups have that cardboard cutout look. It's not terrible, but faces generally don't feel very solid. This is the kind of thing that's been done a lot better since. Other things like the car here, it certainly has some dimensionality to the shot, but there's still not a proper feeling of solidity to the vehicle. And there did feel like a large number of times where, had the film been shot in 3D or filmed with 3D in mind, then various things could have looked a lot better. I know that the director has spoken about initially considering shooting natively and subsequently deciding that post-conversion gave him more scope to do a better job, but from what I can see, that's either him doing a good bit of PR hype, or maybe some of those shots that he set up to work so well for 3D didn't make it to the final cut. So, for example, this guy has a tongue that would put Gene Simmons to shame, but we don't see it from Nicole Scherzinger's point of view, poking out of the screen, which admittedly would have been pretty disgusting, and maybe a bit too obvious perhaps, but this is meant to be a fun and light-hearted film, so I regard that as a bit of a 3D missed opportunity. Or there's a bike chase that passes by these fountains, and when I say it passes by them, that's exactly what it does. It passes them by, failing to ride through them, which could have looked great in 3D. There is quite a funny moment in this scene where Smith's control of the mono-wheeled bike, actually bike's not the right word, is it? I don't know what the word should be, where his control is very wonky, but in terms of 3D, the scene doesn't really offer much. And there's a bit where Tommy Lee Jones smashes a guy with a frying pan so hard that he turns his head flat. Jones does this with some real aggression, and I've got to assume that he was imagining that this guy was his agent and was punishing him for making him do this movie. Anyway, if you're turning someone's head into an actual flat object in a 3D movie, there's surely a fun way of filming it to effectively make a 3D joke, but that's not what they do here. And this fella in the fish tank offers virtually no three-dimensional depth in his space behind the glass, so that's not much good. And another fish tank is wasted in a shot that's nicely framed for effective 3D, and there was a much better version of this view in Aquaman, but there's not much depth here beyond the tank to the people behind. So I did think that a lot of the 3D was disappointingly mild. Like, there's a simple shot that I love in 3D films where the plane of the surface stretches back into the screen, but the surface of the river here, and the same with this road, they don't really do that to much extent. They do a tiny bit, but the amount of depth does feel quite limited. And speaking of limited depth, we get this view in a room where the wall rises up and out of the way to reveal a hidden room behind it. If the 3D was good, this newly revealed space would stretch a nice way back, but again, it really doesn't. There's a bit where they're in a car and the view out of the rear window is completely flat. It's a bit weird, but the effect of this, to my eyes anyway, is that it draws attention to itself and it makes it feel a bit like one of those hokey Hitchcock rear projections. Now, you could argue, of course, that the background is too far away to be able to resolve it in 3D in natural human vision, but that's no fun, and it sort of defeats one of the main advantages of post-conversion, which is that you can put anything into 3D that you want to. And speaking of natural human vision, there are some shots of Manhattan which are very natural looking. That's to say, they're entirely uninteresting from a 3D point of view, with no attempt at all at a fun hyperstereo view. And it's these views that are the first of several where I'd make comparisons with the excellent 3D film Doctor Strange, because that film has similar views of this stunning city, but in superb hyperstereo. Obviously that's much more expensive and difficult to do, but Doctor Strange did it and this film didn't. Doctor Strange also features a moment where a butterfly emerges from the screen in a nice bit of pop-out, and there are butterflies here, but not significantly breaking out of the screen. And more than that, there's a guy who can see various possibilities of future events, which is very Doctor Strange, and when we see him at the ballpark here, we see one of his future visions, but unlike those portals in Doctor Strange, there's hardly any depth into the view beyond here. And just to make a final connection, the character here, who, by the way, I found very annoying, is played by Michael Stuhlbarg, who also played Strange's rival surgeon, and in keeping with the theme, I thought he was a lot better in that film. There is some stuff where the design looks good for 3D, but often the execution just isn't there. Like Emma Thompson's odd but quite cool hairdo, it's a sort of interlayered leaf-like bunches of hair. It could look good in a 3D close-up, but it never does. For every bit of production design that works, like the nice movement here, there are several that don't. Like these banks of people and cameras look like a great setup for 3D, but it's also mild and just not very impressive. I know vegetation can be a very difficult thing to convert into convincing 3D, but it's much easier with the leaves the size of the ones in front of Will Smith here, but they just didn't bother at all with these, so it sits in the same 3D space as he does. It's a minor thing, I suppose, but it's something that other films have done so much better. This is actually quite feeble. And on the subject of other films doing it so much better, there's a shot in the 3D film Need for Speed that I absolutely love. That's also post-converted, and they did this beautiful and creative thing of putting some distant, heavily out-of-focus background lights into different 3D space. Well, no surprises that the ones here all remain on the same dull, flat plane. This bit's kind of interesting in that the 3D version gives you a little bonus over the 2D version. I ripped the 2D Blu-ray for this, so these shots don't show you what's going on in the 3D version, which is that all of those laser beams on the video he's watching sporadically also fire out all around the room. At first it's quite impressive, although I think it's actually a bit of a cheat, as for a lot of it the beams are completely different in each eye, so whilst there's some sort of feeling of 3D, it's not actually genuinely stereoscopic. It was a bit of an odd one. This familiar character turns up at one point, and you can't help him bringing to mind a notorious 3D film of the 1970s, which had his name prefixing the title, although I'm never too sure what Andy Warhol's Flesh for Frankenstein actually had to do with him. Now, I read a lot of favourable comments about this film's 3D when it came out. Like I say, I'm sure it was more impressive in the early days of the modern boom. Even so, for the most part, I'd say the 3D here is fairly uninspiring. It's fair to say, though, that there was actually something behind all that positivity, as, in spite of what I've been saying, there is some good 3D in the film. First of all, some of the more obvious stuff. There are some fairly standard pop-out moments, like the guns, which there are quite a few of, mostly very brief shots, and never in focus, but still, if you like an out-of-focus gun emerging from the screen, then this is fine, I suppose. And there's the odd debris blast, which is reasonably effective, if not especially spectacular, at throwing stuff out of the screen. Baseball pops out in slow motion, and it's a story point too, so that makes its presence in front of the screen a bit less gimmicky. I assume this shot was incredibly easy to convert, and it's all very obvious, but quite fun anyway. There's a sequence that takes place at the Apollo 11 launch pad, and it's really nice to see this major moment in history recreated in 3D. And sometimes the 3D here is pretty good, especially in the bits where we're looking down on the Saturn V. And it's top-down views like this where I think the film's 3D is at its best, and thankfully there are quite a few of them. We look down on Will Smith from high up quite a few times, sometimes as the camera drops down to his level. There's a nice view down onto a pair of jet machines, which looks pretty good too. And it's a view that combines height and falling that's the film's standout sequence. Now, there are some 3D films that I think have received far too much praise for their 3D just because they do one or two things very well. The best example I can think of where the film's 3D for the most part is quite dull and weak, but where there's a set piece of great 3D used a few times, is Dread, from the same year as this film. That movie often gets talked about as being a great example of 3D, but really it just has one piece of imagery that it does extremely well, which is the slow-mo sequences. And in a way, I'd say Men in Black 3 does a similar thing. So for the most part, the 3D is functional, if nothing special, but there's one sequence where it works brilliantly. It begins extremely well with a lovely move up to the top of one of the world's most iconic skyscrapers, ending with a great shot looking down from above. And this prefaces Will Smith's fall from the top of the Chrysler Building, and he falls through time as well as space. It's the film's creative highlight in every sense, not just in terms of the 3D, but it's fair to say that the 3D really does work excellently here, and it makes the sequence significantly more of a visual treat than it is in 2D. At points during this extended fall, things pop out of the screen, whilst it also feels like there's a lot of depth into the screen too. They even have the sense to throw in a load of ticker tape at one point, so it's a great particle moment with lots going on in different space on the Z-axis. And when we get a close-up of his face, the 3D is dialed way up, so his face is super deep and elongated. Again, it's a very creative use of 3D. I'd probably say that for hardcore 3D fans, this sequence alone makes the film worth watching. So just a very quick word about the film itself. I confess that I haven't seen the first two Men in Black films, so I may have missed out on some of the world building, although story-wise it didn't feel like I needed any earlier information. Obviously, comedy's a subjective thing, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who thought this film was hilarious. I'm not one of those people, but laughter doesn't lie, and if someone's having a good chuckle at this one, then there's really no point arguing the fact about whether it's funny. I do like Will Smith, and I think he's given some really strong performances over the years, but where I don't like him so much is when he's just doing the Will Smith shtick, and he seems to be doing that on autopilot here, and it feels like Tommy Lee Jones obviously wanted to be in the film as little as his contract would allow, and they get around that pretty well with Josh Brolin doing a great job of channeling a younger version of his character. Emma Thompson is pretty much wasted, and I assume this movie was just a paycheck for her, so I hope it was a big one. It all seemed very lightweight and came across to me as if no one was really committed to making a great film, but it certainly wasn't unwatchable, and there was a little bit of fun to be had along its modest enough running time. Like I say, I've not seen the first two films, so I don't know how much of a surprise the domestic revelation towards the end was, but I do admit that I'm a bit of a sucker for sentimental stuff like that, so even though I'd felt pretty indifferent to the whole thing from the start, when that moment came, for some reason I got a little bit choked up. Best of all, I think, though, the biggest name involved in the film, and I know he also worked on the first two, was one of cinema's all-time greats, a genuine master of his craft, the legendary pioneering genius Rick Baker, who worked on the film's Aliens. And while his best creations might not be on show here, I do think that any film he worked on deserves a good degree of respect. So the film's kind of okay, the 3D's kind of okay, and once or twice it's genuinely dazzling. So it's one that maybe deserves a place in your 3D Blu-ray collection, but outside of its trump card sequence, I don't think there's much in it to get too excited about. So I hope you found this in some way useful, and if so, I hope you'll join me again soon for another 3D Blu-ray review. Until then, thanks for looking in on this one, cheers for now, bye bye.